Looks like we're good. So, hello everyone. We are coming in for the first video for the month of March. Last week, I didn't get to it because I unfortunately ended up not feeling all that well and not feeling up to the task. So, we were going to go ahead and move forward with this week. So, as I mentioned with the last video, there were a couple topics that I had come up with that I've kind of gotten some interest in recently. And this one is definitely pertain to the upcoming 250th anniversary of our war for independence here in the United States, which is technically this year, although next year is the big celebration because we didn't technically declare independence until 1776. But this does correlate with the American Revolution as a whole, which it's been a while, I think, since we talked about a topic with the American Revolution. I think the last time was when we discussed how Canada's viewpoints had been during the war, and that was, I think, back in October. And before that, it was even longer. So, what we're going to discuss today is what is somewhat, I wouldn't say a little known campaign of the American Revolution, but it's definitely one that doesn't get as much attention as, say, the big battles out in the East between, the main Continental Army with George Washington and the main British forces out there. And this is kind of a backwater to the American Revolution, but it's also one of the most significant backwater victories that comes about during the war. So it is known, it just doesn't get talked about as much as some of the other more well known ones. And that would be the Illinois campaign in what would become the Northwest Territory under the leadership of George Rogers Clark, which, if you are from Indiana or Illinois, you probably know this story quite well. If you're not from those areas, or not from the old Northwest Territory, the areas that now comprises the states of like Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan, if you're not from that, you might not have heard of this as much. Kentucky probably as well has heard about it because of the factor that it does kind of lead to the founding of Louisville, and that is Kentucky's most prosperous city. So, what we're going to discuss is this little campaign that takes place during the American Revolution. What it does is it sees a contingent of Virginia militia pretty much go out across the Appalachian Mountains to try to break what initially the goal is to break Indian attacks that are happening in Kentucky, which at that point Virginia is trying to settle. And the goal is, well, if we go up into the Illinois country and kind of knock out these British posts and these forts and whatever, it might break these Indian attacks because we know that the British were actually instigating these attacks on settlers in Kentucky to try to, in any way hurt the rebellious colonials and what they were trying to do. So, what comes about from this is an American victory on the backwater of the American Revolution. I mean, this is happening out in what will become the Northwest Territory. And at this point, this is pretty much blank wilderness. I mean, there's forests, there's trees, wild rivers. There's not a whole lot of European settlement out in this area at this time. But what it does do is does a significant morale boost, I think, because in terms of military accomplishment, Clark didn't really change the game in any way. I mean, it didn't really influence to a massive amount of, when Britain was willing to basically give the entire eastern portion of its holdings east of the Mississippi River, but south of the Great Lakes to the United States in 1783 during the peace negotiations. I don't really think it played a massive part in that, but it did give this morale boost to Americans at home that even on the frontiers were able to get a victory against the British, and I think that's what the more significant prospect of it is. So to go into this, we mentioned the Illinois country. Now the Illinois country, mind you, there's two different countries out in the Northwest Territory, and by countries we mean territories pretty much. This was just what the British used to call it. And we had the Ohio Territory, which was the Ohio country, which is mostly made up of what will become the U.S. state of Ohio, my home. And then we had the Illinois country, which was a little bit further to the west, but also part of that, also still part of the north of the Ohio River. It's northwest of it in technicality. And the Illinois country was vaguely defined by the time of the American Revolution, by the time of the late 18th century. It's a vaguely defined colonial era. It had pretty much gotten its name from the French, who had once owned the territory prior to 1763 with the conclusion of the French and Indian War. After 1763 and the French losing all of French Louisiana and New France and the mainland North America, that territory becomes under the control of the British Empire. And the Illinois country was defined as being northwest of the Ohio River, and it encompasses mostly the modern day states of both Illinois and Indiana. And the Illinois country at this time is very sparsely settled. There's not a whole lot of major settlements. As I mentioned, it's mostly wilderness. It's not that far uncommon from what Ohio looks like at this time. And those who are there, those settlers that are present in the Illinois country are mostly those who had been there since French rule, and thus a lot of them are French ethnicity. A lot of French settlers are still in the Illinois country, and they are the ones that are primarily the only major European settlers in that little bit of region. Now, Britain would add the territory into the province of Quebec in 1774 in an attempt to try to quell the colonial expansionism that was developing on the 13 main colonies on the East Coast who wanted to expand west of the Appalachians. And of course, they passed the Quebec Act trying to kind of stem that and say, well, all this land now belongs to the province of Quebec, so you can't have it. And the Illinois country is technically included in the province of Quebec at this time as being part of that territory. Now, by the time of the American Revolution breaking out, the Illinois country had less than 1,000 settlers of European ancestry. As we mentioned, most of them were French speaking, or they also had some, if they weren't Native Americans, it also had some African American slaves that had been brought to them. Now, Native Americans, of course, thrived in the Illinois country, much as they did in the Ohio country at this time. This was mostly Native American land. This was native lands. This was not the white man's area. And the Native Americans primarily set up a lot of their villages and settlements along the Mississippi, the Illinois, and the Wabash rivers. This was their primary uh, areas of settlement that they had, was along riverbanks. Now, Britain did not hold a massive military presence in the Illinois country during the American Revolution. It hadn't even really had a massive military presence beforehand. And after the Revolution, what minor military presence it had there very rapidly goes away into almost nothing. And as soon as the war ended up breaking out, this is when Britain basically pulls out all military resources that they had had in the Illinois country. Now, the town of Kaskaskia on the Mississippi would serve as the center of administration for the British, and it would also later serve as a center of administration for the Americans. It would actually become the first state capital of Illinois when it was, excuse me, when Illinois was admitted. Unfortunately, today, Kaskaskia is pretty much abandoned because the course of the Mississippi River had actually changed in the late 19th century, and most of the original settlement is now underwater and well under the banks of the Mississippi River, and most of it's been abandoned to a ghost town today. So it's awfully quite sad to see what has become of it. But back then, it is one of the oldest European settlements west of the Appalachian Mountains, and it serves as the head of British administration in the Illinois country, which it's not a big town by any means. I mean, it's a relatively small settlement. Now, when the war broke out in 1775, Britain would withdraw the 75 troops that they had at Kaskaskia, and they would withdraw these troops to the East Coast to deal with the rebellion that's growing there, leaving only a former French officer named Rocheblav in charge. Now, Rocheblav is not a British military official, but he's pretty much indemnified to be one. And basically, the British argue, you know, we don't there's no military value to this territory massively. We don't see any prospect of these rebellious colonials coming all the way out here and launching any kind of an offensive. So they in their mind, there was no reason to really heavily fortify the Illinois country because they didn't think that the prospect of an upstart American expedition to try to take that territory was even feasible at the time. Mind you, this is 1775. The war just broke out. They don't think this rebellion is going to last long. The course of the war hasn't really played yet, and the British at that time, using their judgment, argue that we can afford to take all the troops out of the territory pretty much and just leave it utterly defenseless because there's no real possibility at that time that there's going to be any kind of colonial attempt to seize it. Now, Kentucky would end up kind of being the offset to that whole scheme. Now, the Ohio River is what marks the official boundary between the Ohio and Illinois countries and what is becoming known as the area of Kentucky, which is at this time primarily claimed by Virginia. Kentucky officially become a state after the Revolution in 1792, after being conceded by Virginia to the federal government's control. But at this time, it's mainly a Virginian expansion project, is what Kentucky is. It's Virginia's expansion project west of the Appalachian Mountains. And Kentucky is trying to be settled by the Virginians who are now, with open war against Britain, are no longer feel that they're no longer bound by the proclamation line of 1763 that had limited their expansion west of the Appalachians. And so many Virginians are trying to settle into the areas that is now Kentucky. Starting in 1777, the British would begin recruiting Native Americans to form war parties that would raid the frontier settlements that were being started by colonials from Pennsylvania and Virginia in the areas of Kentucky and Ohio. And I believe when I had talked about the Northwest Indian War here in Ohio, and I believe that was a couple of years ago, but when I discussed it, I had discussed the factor that during the Revolution, there were Native American raids being spurned by the British, and even after the war was officially over, to try to kind of hurt these nascent settlements that were popping up. And the same thing is happening in Kentucky, not just Ohio at this time. Many of these raids would originate from the Illinois country and from Fort Detroit, where the city of Detroit, Michigan is now. That was a major British fort in the Northwest Territory, and that was a major center of British administration that would arm Native American tribes, would arm Native American war parties, and would kind of send them out, go do Britain's doing. Excuse me. So, in that same year, in 1777, when these raids start occurring in Kentucky, there is a young major in the Kentucky County, Virginia militia named George Rogers Clark. He is only 25 years old at the time of 1777. Now, Clark believed, as a young major in the Kentucky Virginia militia, that he could mount an expedition of sorts to capture the British posts in the Illinois country that were the main primary reason for these raids that were occurring into Kentucky. And he believed that this would stop those native raids if he could do so. He believed that he could do it. He had a feasible plan drawn up on his own that he believed could be accomplished. And he might even, through the process of taking the Illinois country, be able to move on Fort Detroit as far north and try to knock out the British permanently up in the area. Clark would send two spies to Kaskaskia in the Illinois country to ascertain what the British military situation was there. What the spies come back with and tell him is pretty much exactly what Clark wants to hear. They come back in about 2 months and they detail the factor that Kaskaskia is unguarded. There's almost no military presence from the British in the town. The state of the fort there is not the greatest because it's been robbed of military necessities for the war effort back east, and that the French speaking peoples that live in the area and in the town itself hold sympathies to the Americans and not the British, and are very sympathetic to the American cause. So Clark decides that he's going to request permission to do this expedition from the Virginia governor, at that time, founding father Patrick Henry, and he would request permission from Patrick Henry to launch this campaign into the Illinois country. Clark would journey to Williamsburg in order to make his appeal and would present his plan to Governor Henry in December of 1777. The plan was kept a secret. It was not public knowledge. It was not something that was discussed openly, and only a handful of Virginia government members knew about it, such as Governor Henry and Thomas Jefferson. And there were few men that would know about it because they did not want any chance that the British would get word of this upcoming offensive into what they, at the time, the British still think is not in an area that is not in any way, not an area that is not going to be at risk. And they don't want word of this reaching out to the British and them suddenly fortifying that region. Clark convinced Henry during his conversation with him and the State General Assembly that this expedition was a feasible prospect, that he could go in there, knock out these British posts, and actually possibly even take Fort Detroit afterward. And because of getting the convincture of the governor and of the State General Assembly, they end up approving the expedition, though the knowledge of the details for at least the General Assembly's bit were quite vague as to what it would actually entail. Publicly, it was announced that Clark would be raising a defense militia for the purpose of protecting Kentucky, that he was not doing an offensive of any sort, he was simply raising a defensive militia. Secretly, the instructions that were given to Clark Henry would instruct Clark to capture Kaskaskia from the British and then proceed as he saw fit afterwards. Clark would be promoted to lieutenant colonel in the Virginia militia in order to lead this expedition. It would also authorize him to raise 7 companies of 50 men each as the newly formed Illinois Regiment. They would serve for a period of 3 months, but were not going to be told about invading the Illinois country in order to maintain secrecy. So even the men that were signing up to become part of this new Illinois regiment under George Rogers Clark, even they at first were not even fully aware that they were going to be invading the Illinois country. They just thought we're going into Kentucky to try to protect it from these native raids that are happening. They had no idea that they had signed up to go on an invasion. Which is actually something quite astonishing that I had found out was that this had been sort of a kind of so secretive that not even the men that were part of the expedition really knew about it until they were on their way. Clark and his regiment would depart their camp on the Monongahela River on May 12th of 1778, and they would leave with about 150 recruits in 3 separate companies. They would join with another 200 men, at least that was the plan, at the falls of the Ohio at the falls of the Ohio River, where it would eventually become the city of Louisville, Kentucky. That was at least the original plan. They were also accompanied by 20 settler front families that were bound for Kentucky who would travel with the men to Kentucky and try to reach there. Clark's party would end up stopping at both Fort Pitt for supplies and Fort Randolph on the Kanawha River in what is today West Virginia in order to get more supplies. At Fort Randolph, which had recently been sacked by native raids, they were asked to stay and help, but Clark felt that they didn't have the time to really pitch in and help rebuild the fort and decided to press on anyway to the Falls of the Ohio. They would reach the falls on May 27th of 1778. So they would reach the Falls of the Ohio on May 27th and set up an encampment base on Corn Island, which was a small little island in the middle of the Ohio River at that point. And during this time, he would also reveal to his men that the real purpose of their expedition was not to protect Kentucky from native raids, but to go into the Illinois country and actually go on the invasion, of which the men actually greeted with applause and actual enthusiasm. The men were actually quite pleased that they would be going on an offensive instead of simply doing a defensive job. The settlers who had joined Clark and his men to travel to Kentucky would settle on Corn Island, and the following year, in 1779, would move to the mainland on the Ohio River and found the city of what would become Louisville, Kentucky. So Louisville can actually trace its roots to Clark's expedition to the Illinois country, because that was where the original settlers ended up actually arriving from. So Clark would depart Corn Island on June 24th of 1778 with his men. Now, they did not get the promised reinforcements of like 200 men that had been promised that was going to meet up with them on Corn Island at the Falls of the Ohio. That did not actually materialize. And since that had not materialized, the final troop number that they ended up marching off with from Corn Island was 174 men in 4 companies. They would reach the mouth of the Tennessee River on June 28th. Now, at the Tennessee River, Clark could have just decided to take a boat, travel up down the remainder of the Ohio, and then go up the Mississippi River to Kaskaskia, but he wanted the element of surprise, and coming up the river on a river town was probably not going to be the best idea, especially given the factor that Kaskaskia had a fort overlooking the river. So instead, he needs to take the overland route, and he decides to do this through the southern tip of what is now the state of Illinois instead of traveling upstream on the Mississippi. They would capture several boats shortly afterward, after deciding to take this overland track, that were belonging to a hunting party led by John Duff, who had been to Kaskaskia quite recently. He informed Clark of the current conditions of the town and also joined him as a guide for the campaign along with his other men. They would end up landing their vessels on the north bank of the Ohio after transferring Clark's men across near the ruins of the old French fort, Fort Massac, which would be their main area that they would launch their overland march from. The party would march about 50 miles before reaching a wide open prairie, which, if you've ever been to Illinois or if you live in Illinois, I've been to Illinois about going on 3 years ago, there is quite expansive prairies that you can sometimes see in the state that are quite beautiful to look at, but at the same time, compared to here in Ohio, we don't have anything like them. They would end up arriving outside the town of Kaskaskia on July 4th of 1778. Now, after midnight, the men ended up crossing the Kaskaskia River and secured the town without even firing a shot. Rochablav, who the British had left in charge to head Kaskaskia in their absence, was captured while sleeping inside the fort. He was actually captured while in bed. He was not even awake, and the next thing he knew, he had a bunch of colonial militia in his room with guns pointed at him. It was a very easy capture of the town, just as Clark had wanted, and he had attained the element of surprise through his mark. Clark went about the town the next morning, securing the allegiance of the local townspeople. He also was helped by the newly announced Franco American alliance, which helped to get many of the native ethnic French settlers on his side and really get them to actually go for the Patriot cause. Residents took an oath of loyalty to both the state of Virginia and to the United States, and Clark did the same with several nearby French settlements such as Cahokia and St. Philippe, which would end up falling a day later on July 5th. So just to show the expedition so far, or where we're at this point by this July 5th of 1778. I mean, we don't have a whole lot of images here, really. Not a massive lot. So here we have a depiction of Clark. Clark never actually had a portrait of him done in life, so any portraits that we have of him are what it's imagined or been told from eyewitness accounts. But we have no life portrait that was made of him during his time alive. This was made shortly after his death. But this is one of the more commonly used depictions of him. Mind you, he was only 25 years old at the time. He was not a very old man at all. Huh, excuse me. And then here we have a map that we will come back and refer to. So far, I'm going to mark it here with a pen. We have Clark's men who have went down the Monongahela, down the Ohio River. They've traveled down the Ohio River. And where I'm trying to think. I think this is where Louisville would be. Yes, I believe so. So first, we're going down the Ohio River. So we have them departing from up here on Monongahela, going down the Ohio, and coming up through that, and then right in here, I believe is where Louisville would be. It, for some reason, is not really marked on this map, probably because it didn't really exist yet at the time. But this were about where they would rendezvous, and then they would set off from there at Louisville. They would come down here to the mouth of the Tennessee. So this down here is the mouth of the Tennessee River. So what normally we would do is just come up the river and then you would come up here to Kaskaskia, but he doesn't want to do that, given that he wants the element of surprise. So instead, he needs to go across the Ohio and then come up overland onto Kaskaskia and come up that way. And that is the route that Clark ends up taking. So he ends up kind of crossing about it. This map depicts it a little further north for some odd reason, but that's not even the mouth of the Tennessee River. So they end up crossing and then coming up into Kaskaskia, and that is where they end up coming in. So here's Kaskaskia on the Mississippi, way out here. And we'll come back to that because we're going to have to still use that for the remainder of the campaign that we have here. And then here we have just a depiction of that moment when Rochambeau, who was in bed at the time in the fort at Kaskaskia when Clark and his men arrived, ended up getting captured in his while he was sleeping. Presumably, I'm gonna guess with his wife. Over 300 local inhabitants in the occupied towns that Clark and his men had taken would take the oath of loyalty. Clark would actually send Kaskaskia's priest, Father Gabalt, to nearby Vincennes, which is today in just across the Wabash River in Indiana, on July 14th by horse. Gabalt would return in early August and report that the American flag now flew over Vincennes' Fort Sackville, and had also pledged allegiance to the American cause. Clark would send one of his captains to take command of the fort at Vincennes, his objective now seemingly done. So at this point, he's achieved what Henry sent him out to do. Your goal was to capture Kaskaskia and then move as you saw fit. And at this point, Clark is planning on probably getting ready to plan some kind of an offensive on taking Fort Detroit up in what is now Michigan. Now, the problem that comes for Clark is the British actually have a reaction to this move. They don't just let it go by without anything. The British Lieutenant Governor of Quebec, Henry Hamilton, actually ended up learning of the American capture of Kaskaskia and Vincennes in August. And he decides to actually launch a counterstrike to try to recapture these areas from Clark and his men. He ends up deciding to do so, and he will reestablish British control in the Illinois country and prevent Clark from attacking Detroit, which is his big fear that's going to happen. Hamilton would depart Detroit on October 7th with a detachment of 40 volunteers from Detroit itself, 85 militia, and a Royal Artillery detachment, along with over 60 Odawa and Ojibwe warriors from those tribes. They would be joined by another 33 militiamen and 200 warriors from the Shawnee, Miami, and Potawatomi tribes during the march. On December 17th of 1778, Hamilton would end up surprising the Americans at Fort Sackville in Vincennes, and end up capturing Fort Sackville and the town as a whole relatively quickly. Hamilton ended up deciding to winter at Fort Sackville. He would not continue the march to Kaskaskia, as if it's at this point dead winter had fallen, and winter is usually the off season for campaigning. So he argues, I will overwinter in camp here to hold the place. The warriors and militia can go back home. I will camp here with the regulars, and we will resume this march in the spring to retake the Illinois country. So that was what Hamilton ended up doing immediately. Clark became aware of Vincent's capture in early January of 1779. He was not aware of it at first. He realized the need to launch a immediate surprise attack in order to retake Fort Sackville, or else he would risk Hamilton retaking the Illinois country in the spring once the spring thaw came and the campaigning season came out. So he would set out for Vincennes on February 6th with over 170 men, mostly comprised of French militia drawn from the towns that had pledged allegiance to them. They would travel across Illinois, with Clark's men journeying over 180 miles to reach Vincennes, and it was not a short trek. And mind you, this was in the middle of wilderness, in the middle of dead winter. Now, luckily for Clark's men, they didn't have to deal with bitter cold. It wasn't so much bitter cold at this time. The big problem was it was wet. There had been a lot of rain. It had been a wet January, a wet early February, and the ground is utterly soaked. And in places, there is water literally up to your waist or shoulders deep during this long march that they have. The damp conditions meant that most of the prairies that they would have to march across were covered with water. The party would reach the Little Wabash River on February 13th, which had to be crossed by canoe due to how wide it was. They would then find the Embarrass River to hide across on a few days later on February 17th, and the men would end up traveling down to the Wabash River to try to find a crossing there, and then crossed by on the Wabash by boat 9 miles from Vincennes. Hamilton. So let's see here. We use that one. So just to kind of track the march here, well, we'll do it here in a second. So Clark's party would end up encountering hunters from Vincennes who would inform him that the town's inhabitants, even 9 miles out from the town, were still sympathetic. That the town's inhabitants were still sympathetic to the American cause, and despite the fact that they were only 9 miles out, the British were still unaware of his movement toward it. Clark would end up sending a messenger on February 21st with a letter to the residents of Vincennes that instructed them to keep inside their homes. Keep inside, do not go out. We are moving in with an army. If you are caught outside of your home, you will be treated as a hostile. Of course, The townspeople have no problem staying indoors when there's a battle about to ensue, and none of them thought to inform Hamilton that the Americans were coming, just showing how sympathetic they were to the American cause. That even though they had heads up that Clark was coming, none of them sent any kind of a message to Hamilton forewarning him of the upcoming attack. Clark would enter Vincennes at sunset on February 23rd. He ended up securing the town and then sending a detachment of soldiers to open fire on Fort Sackville, of which Hamilton was still inside and sleeping at the time, not aware that the town had quietly been taken out from under him. Hamilton at first thought that the gunfire he heard was simply drunk soldiers, that there was no immediate attack, but soon realized what was going on and then ordered his men in the fort to return fire. During the night, Clark's men would end up keeping up their fire on Fort Sackville and moved within 30 yards of the walls in order to try to get closer shots. They would end up firing through the open portholes in the walls and even managed to knock out the fort's main cannon. At mid morning on the 24th of February, Clark would send a call for unconditional surrender to Hamilton that morning. Hamilton refused at first, but he did request a 3-day truce with Clark and a meeting with him, which was granted by Clark to do. They would decide to meet at the church in Vincennes, and at the church, Clark would again demand unconditional surrender from Hamilton and his garrison, of which Hamilton at first is very reluctant to do. But he slowly comes to the realization the townspeople are against him. His main gun's been knocked out. You're surrounded, dude. Like there's no getting out of this. They would end up striking a compromise, and that would see the British surrender the fort as prisoners of war, and they would be able to march out with their arms. Hamilton would officially surrender Fort Sackville on February 25th of 1779. 79 British soldiers were end up being taken prisoner as the American flag was raised once again over the fort, and Fort Sackville was renamed by Clark as Fort Patrick Henry after Governor Patrick Henry of Virginia. Hamilton, along with 7 officers and 18 others, would be sent as prisoners of war to Williamsburg, Virginia, where they would remain for a time. And the remainder of the troops under Hamilton's command were paroled and allowed to return to Fort Detroit. So, a brilliant victory on Clark's part at Vincennes, just as he had accomplished at Kaskaskia, because he marched in the dead of winter. Hamilton had not expected the Americans to move during the winter on the fort. He had pretty much let go of a large portion of the force he had taken the fort with, which also left him at a disadvantage. And when Clark and his men moved, by the time Hamilton realized what was going on, he had already lost the town and was simply getting surrounded in his fort. So to track that march, so we have Kaskaskia here. I'm going to circle it so it's a little bit more obvious here. So here's Kaskaskia. Vincennes is just across the Wabash River in what is today Indiana. This is Vincennes. Or Vincennes. I'm not entirely aware how they pronounce it, but this would be just across the river in what is now Indiana. So Clark and his men trek 180 miles, as you can see by the line here. I mean, there's already a line on it. I'm just going to kind of double check it. In the dead of winter, during some of the most wet conditions possible, they trek across to get there in order to re-seize this, because knowing that if they don't and let Hamilton keep this until the spring, he'll be able to march to Kaskaskia and retake the entire Illinois country and everything that they've done. So here we have a depiction of Clark's men actually marching through the wilderness on their march there, and it's just some of the condition. In this condition, it seems like the water is up to their waist. And a lot of the soldiers went without some rations for a couple days. I mean, it was a miserable march for a lot of the men. So not due to the cold, but due to the dampness that they encountered. Sometimes they went in water up to their shoulders. It was that deep and muddy. It was a very damp march to get to Vincennes from Kaskaskia. And here is a diorama of what Fort Sackville looked like. It was not a large fort by any means. It was a wood block fort. It was not concrete in any form. It lay right on in the town of Vincennes on the Wabash River, which was over here. Not the most massive of forts, but enough that for a small frontier town like it was enough to hold it. And this was the main obstacle that Hamilton had kind of actually barricaded himself indoors once he ended up losing the town. And then here there's been a couple of famous paintings done of the moment of the day that Hamilton surrendered Fort Sackville to the Americans, and this is one of the better ones in my opinion of the British and regulars and the militia coming out of the fort with the assembled Virginia militia outside receiving the surrender, with Clark receiving Henry's surrender personally, and the American flag now raised over the fort. So that was the majority of what Clark's campaign was. Now, Clark's victories, as I mentioned at the start of the video, his victories in Illinois country did aid the U.S. claims to the Northwest Territory by breaking the British authority in the region. It didn't definitively conquer it, but what it did do was kind of break the backbone of British claims saying, oh, yeah, we control this, without problem. Well, that's now kind of contested because while the Americans don't control it either, the British obviously don't have a solid foothold on it either because they've allowed two major American victories come on this backwater frontier front of war. Kentucky's settlement, due to the campaign, it would serve the purpose of ending a lot of the native raids on Kentucky that was being spurned by the British. And settlement in Kentucky would end up growing after 1779 with the capture of at Fort Sackville. Virginia would try to claim the region due to Clark's exploits and the fact that Clark himself and his men were a Virginia militia, of which Virginia would relinquish those claims in 1781 of the region to the federal government, which would end up creating the Northwest Territory out of the region in 1787 with the Northwest Ordinance, which would eventually create, as I mentioned, the states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan would come out of that, and part of Minnesota was in that, I believe, as well. But that concludes for Clark's campaign. It wasn't in terms of like military importance, it wasn't, the big game changer, but it gave a big morale boost on a front that really the British were kind of caught with their pants down. I mean, in all honesty, because they did not keep this region well fortified enough to resist a simple attack like this. But it did offer a big morale boost, I think, for Americans at the time, because this is right after, 1777, where I believe 1777 we had lost our capital at Philadelphia. We had gone through the winter of Valley Forge shortly after. This was not a great time for the Continental Army, and these victories definitely came on the heels of that. And it did it did break in some form the British authority that they had over the territory. And I don't think it had a major impact on Britain's decision to grant that territory to the United States at at the Treaty of Paris of 1783. But I do think it may have played a tiny role as to why they were more willing to give that up, realizing that they did not have the solid control over that region that they thought they did. So that could also have been a conflict. And in a way, it turns the settlement of Kentucky, which will hasten Kentucky's admission as a state within about less than 20 years after that point. So that concludes for that video. Just wanted to kind of discuss that campaign a little bit more in depth because it's not really, I don't think it gets as much attention as some of the bigger, more famous ones like Yorktown or, the Battle of Long Island or Battle of Trenton or, the Siege of Boston. It doesn't get as much attention as those do, but it's just as significant in many ways. So if anyone has any comments, any questions, or anything like that, feel free to put that in the comment section, and I'll be more than free and happy to go look through them when I get the chance. So that next week, I believe I do have another one lined up for one to hit. I just got to figure out how we're going to hit it yet because it's a little more complicated. We'll see how that goes. Yeah, I'm still trying to figure out how to do it. Might have to make one or two videos depending on how it goes, but we'll see how that ends up hitting. So that concludes for this week's video. So hopefully everyone has a good rest of their week, a good rest of their day, and we'll see you all back here next week for the next historical video when we have it come out. So until then, hopefully everyone stays well, and we'll see you then.